Well, hello and good evening. It gives me great pleasure to introduce this Royal College of Psychiatrists President's Lecture. And we have Dr. Saul Levin with us giving the talk. And Saul is one of the leading psychiatrists in the whole world. And he's going to talk about the LGBTQ journey in psychiatry and the American Psychiatric Association. And there's no one better to deliver this address than Saul. Now, before I introduce Saul formally, I just wanted to say a few thank yous. My biggest thank you is to the College Rainbow Special Interest Group. And the Rainbow Special Interest Group is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year, and they've done fantastic work over the last 2 decades. So a big thank you to their chair, Moira Cooney. Moira, you've done a fantastic job in the last few years. It's been challenging times, interesting times as well, and we've moved the agenda forward. So thank you for all your help. And Moira demits office this summer. Also, I'd like to thank our past chair, Daniel Hodgson, finance officer, Josep Villanova, the executive committee, Jonathan Gibb, Helen Gillespie, Alan McKenzie, Louise Theodousou, and the great Michael King. Thank you so much for all you've done, and really best of luck to Pavan Joshi, who will take on the role of chair in the summer. So thank you to all of you. So what of Saul Levin? Saul, thank you so much for joining us. It's 11 o'clock in the morning in the US. So thank you for joining us. Saul really needs no introduction. He's the Chief Executive Officer and Medical Director of the American Psychiatric Association. And I'm very honored that he is an honorary fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists as well. So prior to assuming his role at the APA in October 2013, Dr. Levin led the District of Columbia Department of Health, where he was responsible for the health of the health of the nation's capital, really quite something. And he promoted the development of a citywide health information exchange that connects healthcare providers and shares critical information. He also served on the DC Health Exchange Board, where he successfully led the effort to ensure that residents of the District of Columbia had access to a full range of substance abuse and mental health services. He's also served as Vice President for Science, Medicine and Public Health at the American Medical Association. He's a former president and CEO of Medical Education for South African Blacks, an anti-apartheid education trust that provided scholarships in for South African Black students in healthcare. He received his medical degree from the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, completed his residency in psychiatry at the University of California, and also has a master's degree in public administration from Harvard. Quite a CV. But more importantly, Saul is an amazing friend of the college and friend of mine. He has great integrity, vision and drive. He has great humor combined with a rich humanity. So, Dr. Levin, over to you, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. Good evening. As James said, I'm Saul Levin, the CEO Medical Director of APA. I'm also a clinical professor at George Washington University Medical School. And I'm saying this only in some ways as disclosures. I also am the chair of the APA Foundation Board of Directors. I get all my income from APA and no other outside income. If it does happen that I get an honorarium, it goes to the foundation. I'd like to first take a moment to recognize Professor Adrian James, for inviting me to deliver these remarks and being an important global ally in the leader of psychiatry. And we really do appreciate that. My counterpart also, Paul Rees, who is a transformational leader and has convened so many important discussions, and that he has really changed both the RCP and the House of Medicine, both, I think, hopefully in the United Kingdom, but also even here at in the United States. We are truly following sort of what he's done with his administration at the Royal College. And last but not least, a Rainbow Special Interest Group for all its members for the important work to promote, treat, and research the mental health of LGBTQ people to enable them to be good, to have good, proper mental health care. I wanted to take some time today or this evening to share my experiences as a gay man in the House of Medicine and as an international medical graduate in the United States. I was born in South Africa during the time of apartheid. I knew I was gay from a very young age. That's another story, because sometime you'll hear it somewhere else. I grew up very much feeling the personal impact of apartheid, both as a Jewish person, as a gay person, and seeing the discrimination to the Black community, including the lack of training of Black doctors, where there were 40 million Blacks and only 5 million whites, and 98% of the positions at the universities went to white men and women. So I really saw in a population where the majority are Black that we were not creating the workforce to really take care of all the 45 million that ultimately, when the takeover came or the new government came, they were ready to step forward. Hence M.P.A, which actually provided literally 80% of doctors, nurses, dentists in the 20 years of apartheid. And Mandela and Bishop Tutu used to comment, and actually were very big supporters of M.P.A in fundraising to bring those scholarship money in. During the LGBT, what was it like being LGBT, and I'll say lesbian and gay, or LGBTQI? I know we've got, we've now all sort of put all of us together, which is important. But during apartheid, being gay was illegal. It was punishable up to 7 years in prison. There were raids on gay bars, beatings and arrests, not unlike the United States, that led to Stonewall. And while gay white people were officially banned from being in military, they were still drafted. That meant a white man would have to use their homosexuality to avoid service. But those who were conscripted were subject to ridicule, violence, sub rosa, and overt physical and mental abuse, and were not well accepted in the platoons. We saw echoes of that recently in the Trump administration, and I'll get more on this, when he created the ban on transgender people in the military, which was fortunately overturned. And I'll talk a little more about that. I want to also talk about unsung heroes in the LGBT movement and mention one person who changed the nation around equality for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning South Africans. He was a hero. Simon Akoli was a gay Black man, a freedom fighter during the struggle, and was imprisoned for his part of being in the liberation struggle. He helped by his heroism to ensure that LGBT freedom and equality in the new democracy could occur in the new constitution. And how did he do it? He was in prison with many of the top leaders of the movement, and he did not tell them he was gay. He was always worried about what they would say, because gayness was still, if frowned upon, was also, like in many nations, frowned upon, if you were gay. And he realized, as he began to hear the discussions that he participated in, as they were talking about the new constitution they were going to create, that no one ever mentioned the lesbian gay community. And he finally took the giant step of coming out to them. At first they were shocked, they said they didn't realize it, whatever. But as he began to talk to them about what it was like being gay, they all said, we need to ensure that in this constitution, when we take over, that LGBT freedom and equality is guaranteed in the constitution. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. He ultimately worked for Nelson Mandela when Nelson Mandela was president. And today, South Africa is the only country in Africa that actually has equality for LGBT people. So clearly, a unsung hero. Homophobia, like racism, still remains as it does across the world. But the end of apartheid meant legal rights for Black people and gay people as well. As an international medical graduate, many people were welcoming when I got to the United States, but I also faced some biases, and it was subtle and not so subtle. Whether it was someone who said they couldn't understand my accent, or someone who made assumptions based on my home country, or it was what you might call othering, that I was the other, not part of them, combined with being a gay man, I had to overcome and still encounter LGBTQ obstacles. I also understood in my role as a leader that I could represent an LGBTQ person at the table, and that my views and perspectives, choices, and speaking up could help not only our community, my community, but everyone. The reaction I saw in the AIDS crisis in South Africa was still very fresh in my mind when I came to this country, and I was saddened to see very little being done to combat the problem in the United States in the late 80s when I first came to the United States. I began working at what is now called SAMHSA in Health and Human Services, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Administration, where I was asked to head up a big initiative around looking at how we can ensure that HIV treatment, prevention, treatment, and intervention really was put through the whole healthcare system. And we pulled together all the different specialties, all the different professional groups to try and say to them, you have to begin to start looking how to take care of people with HIV. We actually got real resistance at times. But in the end, they all came around. They realized that HIV was going to come into their practices, whether they liked it or not. But I also learned another valuable lesson as I watched the populations affected disproportionately of HIV. That is the gay population versus the Haitian population versus the prostitutes versus the Black men who also transmitted their HIV to their wives and partners, and then the IV drug users, who, when the Americans first started to finally give money around the HIV infection, I began to see all these groups begin to fight for that pot of money, divided up. The gay community said we were the majority of people affected by the disease, we should get the majority of the money. The Black members who had HIV said, we need to get more money because obviously if we catch it, we give it to our wives and our partners. And likewise, the prostitutes, the IV drug abusers all began to fight for these measly dollars. And it dawned on me that what the government had successfully done was essentially by giving us a pot of money and saying, you decide how you want to spend it, they began to split us. And it is what I call my pain is worse than your pain as we sat around that table. Instead of us saying, we aren't being given enough money. The amount the government is allocating to HIV was insufficient, and they should be combining their voices, essentially such like ACT UP did for us, to demand more research, prevention, treatment, and care dollars at all levels of government. And I bring this up because in some ways, I feel the same struggle is occurring today as we strive for an anti-racist society. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Later in my career, I became the health director of Washington, D.C., a wonderful job. I was able to set policy that was literally one person away from people who were living in the district with all their health problems. And I saw the power of the local government in addressing the health and mental health and substance abuse disorders. And with the mayors and city council partnership, we began to coordinate all health services. But during my first year, a piece of legislation came before my desk that it would allow transgender individuals to not only correct their birth certificates, but to get a new birth certificate to reflect the gender that they identified with. The question was, what route would we take? Many in the community and the court said that a judge should make that decision to give them, to change their designation, or the health department through the registrar's office could issue new birth certificates. And often what would happen when you would go to the court was the judge would order that they could change whether they're a man or a woman, male or female, but he would just order them that they strike out on their original birth certificate, that male, because they now, and then they type in female. And it became very clear to me that was really discriminatory. And I heard a lot of it from the transgender community. So it became almost an inclusive, when the legislation was signed, a way to become inclusive in terms of birth certificates that would really help people, become who they are without having people begin to question, why is this crossed out on your birth certificate? But it wasn't a decision made by just government officials. I had allies in the transgender population. They educated me and my senior staff, including the registrars who wanted the courts to do it. And there I was told about how the degradation of when someone was going to court to ask the judge before the judge, they'd have to go through the magnetometers, where the security guards would frisk them down roughly, making jokes that this is a man, but he thinks he's a woman. And the indignity of having to go into a public court to discuss intimate details of why they feel their gender was different. On the flip side, in some of DOH, it was felt it wasn't up to them to issue the new certificates, as their religious or moral grounds felt that was incorrect. I'm proud that with the support of the transgender community and the mayor, and with them, I believe we made the correct decision of dignity and understanding of who we are, who we feel we are, and who they have a right to life, liberty, and freedom. And ultimately, I instructed the registrar that he had to issue new birth certificates with the person's sex that they felt they were. No crossing out from the original birth certificate. They got a new one. And from that, they were therefore able to go and get new driver's license, passports, travel visas, with the innate feeling of who they are, because that was defined by the sex on the birth certificate. Now they would have it where that was just who they were in terms of the new certificate. In 2013, I was appointed to the head of the American Psychiatric Association as the CEO medical director. I inherited a structure of governments that separated out into the governance, where we essentially were divided up the minority and underrepresented groups into 7 groups. We call them the cauci or caucuses, and these groups were American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, Asian American and Pacific Islanders, Black, Hispanic, international medical graduates, LGBTQ, and women. However, what we also begin to realize today now is that the intersectionality and the current beliefs needs to be revisited as to why such a separation. APA started the work over the past year on dismantling structural racism across the APA and in psychiatry. It is going to be a marathon. It is not a sprint rate. We need to do this correctly based on our history of racism going back 400 years in the United States. Meanwhile, in order to ensure that our people belong to the minority groups, they need to have a voice in our organization. APA has rapidly moved to ensure that our elections, our councils, our expert councils, and our staff are more representative of the diversity of the APA and the population. I believe in the mantra, when making decisions at the table, do it with us if you're talking about us, meaning we should always try to have a place at the table for all MUR persons represented. The caucuses help make that happen. The MUR caucuses, the minority underrepresented caucuses, provide networking opportunities, advance treatment of minority populations, advocate for minority health issues, provide representation in APA governance, and foster communications amongst members who share interests. The MUR caucuses also are represented in the APA Assembly, essentially our parliament, which is more an advisory body that then goes to the board to make it the ultimate policy. These caucuses provide guidance to our activities daily, and they ensure that the voices of minorities are heard. We know it is essential to the future of APA and psychiatry. But before we attempt to understand the future of LGBTQ people in psychiatry, we must take a look at our past. In the years since the founding of APA, and I think the Royal College, I know there were different names, like APA had 3 different names before it became the APA. We have grown as a society and a profession. And while it may not have been as quick as we would have liked to do positive change, this change has begun and become. If you want to see the APA and where we are culpable on our racism within this country, please go and read Dr. Jeffrey Geller, our past president series on historical articles where APA was racist and culpable in propagating racism. Interesting enough, that it was a split whether there should be combined hospitals before the Union was founded of the United States, when it was still a British colony, where there all blacks and whites were in one hospital. There was a split at APA of the time, where the blacks should have a separate hospital and whites have a separate one. And essentially that group won out, whereas the other group who said we should continue it. So we in some ways also have some culpability for taking, for creating the racism that has affected the black people in this country, but then also it goes to all those minority groups. Today, the majority of openly gay psychiatrists in the United States, including myself, are able to practice free from worry that their sexual orientation will not cost them their job or medical license. And that's not quite true. Under the Trump administration, I did begin to fear as I began to see the rhetoric against LGBTQI people begin to raise its head. There are timelines that we have in the country as to what did we do in the United States as psychiatrists in some ways to pathologize LGBTQ persons, including LGBTQ physicians. I'm not going to go through that list and the DSM, all the changes in the DSM, but I am going to start off something that I think was very pivotal, was the psychoanalyst movements, of the 1800s and the early 1900s or the 1900s, essentially missed something that Freud said or discounted it. In 1935, Sigmund Freud states in a letter to an American mother that homosexuality is assuredly no advantage, but it is nothing to be ashamed of, no vice, no degradation. It cannot be classified as an illness. And yet somehow after his death, that began to change. And it was with that change that you began to see in DSM-1, where homosexuality was listed as a sociopathic personality disorder. The Kinsey report obviously came out with a sliding scale of human sexuality that obviously was condemned by the psychiatrists of the time or the psychoanalysts of the time. So I have to say, that if I go through all of these, it truly shows that there's been changes in DSM that were done as we changed it to begin to remove homosexuality from the APA, from the DSM. I think the one thing I do have to remind people is that when we got to the DSM-5, the issue of what do we have in there around homosexuality. And I think what happened there was that we realized, and the transgender community came to us and said, if you totally take out that homosexuality, including LGBTQI people, have no mental illness, that they would be unable in the transgender community to get insurance for their surgeries. And it was because of that that we essentially left part of it in the DSM-5 to ensure that the insurance companies would still do a code for that. We obviously have gotten a lot better in terms of our position statements. In 2000, we did support for same-sex civil unions. In DSM-5, we include the non-mental health disorders of gender dysphoria I just spoke about. But I think one of the other pivotal things that I do have to give in 2019 that has really helped the LGBTQI community was when the American Psychoanalytic Association apologized for their past views that pathologized homosexuality and transgender identities. And they wrote what I thought a really good apology. They wrote, regrettably, much of our past understanding of homosexuality as an illness can be attributed to the American psychoanalytic establishment. While our efforts in advocating for sexual and gender diversity since are worthy of pride, it is long past the time to recognize and apologize for our role in the discrimination and trauma caused by our profession, to say we are sorry. And I think that has really gone a long way to begin to start at least salving the wound of all the gay and lesbian people, over the years, over literally the 100 years of the abuse, trauma, in some ways, even victimization, because of them saying that homosexuality was pathology. The other big hero for us was John Fryer. In the early 1970s, the United States was riding a wave of social change that began in the 60s. Women's rights, call for the women's vote, LGBTQ equality rights. Though some strides had been made for many minority groups, the social climate for members of the LGBTQ community was still treacherous. Our own association classified homosexuality as a mental disorder, where if you were outed, you were very likely to cost the gay psychiatrist their medical license, their job, their career, and even eviction from their homes. Activists in the LGBTQ movement were pressurizing the psychiatry field to evolve. And a pivotal moment came when Dr. H. Anonymous, AKA John Fryer, put on this huge mask. If you've seen the pictures, it actually was a Nixon mask, but because John Fryer was a fairly large man, they had to distort the mask to get it on his head. Where there he essentially said, 49 years ago in 1972 at that meeting, he said, you know what? You need to really look at your psychiatrists because we are part of you. And he came out with those immortal words, I am a psychiatrist. I am one of you. And I have to say those words really shocked the psychiatrists sitting in that audience, because many did not actually think that there were gay people. And yet we later learned that in the back room behind the stage, there were about 12 psychiatrists, some of them leaders of APA, who were gay, and yet no one ever knew. So he taught us, just like Simon Nicoli, that we do have to speak up. I'm happy to say the vast majority of our members now today are dedicated to improving the mental health of minority and underrepresented groups like the LGBTQ people, but we still have much work to be done. While in 2015, legislation legalized same-sex marriage, which struck a blow to inequality in this country, there are a number of persistent issues that APA and we as psychiatrists still need to confront. We paid there's much attention what was going on at the federal level, particularly during the aftermath of the Trump administration. I mentioned the Trump's administration ban on transgender personnel in the military, which only perpetuated discrimination and stigma. But more importantly, it deprived the military of valuable individuals who want to serve their country, because many of those transgender people happened to be the interpreters who were fluent in the Middle Eastern languages, and they were forced out. I was glad to see in APA to see President Biden overturn that policy or that executive order when he first came on. The Affordable Care Act in Obamacare, when it passed, included Section 1557, which means that full compendium of medical services are required by law to be delivered by LGBTQ people without discrimination, with our federal parity laws. President Trump tried to do away with Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. And once again, President Biden has come in to once again fix that we can go back to a healthcare system that really needs to take care of all. Meanwhile, in the states themselves, the jurisdictions are beginning to impact patients' lives. This country, as we saw in the election between Trump and President Biden, that it is divided. And it is divided in some ways now being caused by the religious freedom issues that have come up. Legislation around the bathroom bills that were passed in North Carolina in 2016 continue now to crop up as the guise of religious freedoms. APA is vigilant, such as when bills like this arise, and we actively lobby against them to show the harmful effects that they do. Conversion therapy, while as of last month, there was banned, 20 states have banned in the District of Columbia of conversion therapy. but many of them said only for minors, that still for people over the age of 18 or 21, they can still undergo conversion therapy. And it is the religious organizations that are still propagating that they can do successful gay conversion. APA has held an official position against conversion therapy, and we really fight it at every state level. I think the other thing that has come up, you may have seen, was in fact that now those transgender women who are transgender women are now being told they're not allowed to compete in sports at their schools, because they essentially were men, and therefore they have an extra advantage because of being men first in terms of their musculature. And we are fighting that, and it's actually has become very concerning to us as we look at the laws that started in Mississippi, Missouri, Kansas, Florida, Illinois, Indiana, West Virginia, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, Utah, Arizona, North Carolina, South Carolina, Kentucky, and Montana. And if you know the way United States, where these states are, they tend to be the southern states. The states that, the states are also where they went to war about wanting to retain slavery against the North. And likewise, they're doing the same thing now in terms of the LGBT community. We oppose these bills. I think the other part that we need to work to is, what are we all doing? I want to thank the World Psychiatric Association, who have begun addressing these issues when they occur outside the United States. And particularly the president of your Royal College of Psychiatry a few years ago, Dinesh Bugra, who led the movement both at FRCP, the WPA, and M.P.A. And I have to thank each president since then for really continuing to struggle for the equality of the LGBT community. In 2014, APA urged the president of Uganda to reject a law imposed on severe prison sentences of Ugandans who were engaging in homosexual behavior. And he used DSM as the reason why he was imposing these severe penalties. And we in the community wrote to him and said he actually is incorrect. He's looking at a DSM that was most probably DSM 2 or 3, that we no longer have it in there. And while he did hold off for a while, clearly it became politically advantageous, and he finally signed the bill. Even today in Kenya, which is not protecting the LGBT populations, and particularly with the displaced LGBTQ persons in refugee camps. So even now today, we're still seeing LGBT people being victimized, murdered, refused to be able to have jobs or places to stay. In each of these instances, APA has cited international recognized scientific reports and amicus briefs put together to address many of the anti-LGBT issues in the United States. So here I go to my closing thoughts. APA works to ensure that LGBTQI people have a voice, both in our association and in psychiatry at large, and that the next generation of psychiatrists are trained in cultural competency so they can best care for an increasingly diverse set of patients. And I'm not just talking about LGBTQI, I'm talking about all the groups that are considered minority or underrepresented. Ensuring that the psychiatric workforce is well-versed in delivering high-quality, culturally competent care will go a long way. For one thing, it will strengthen our relationships as physicians with minority and underrepresented groups, but also with our patients. I was the president of the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association many years ago, and I was once asked, what would you like to achieve? And I said, what I'd love to achieve is that in every physician's office, he has the gay flag just put there somewhere where when a patient comes in to see it, because they don't all put one little pamphlet on it, because that would send a message that it would be a safe place for the person coming in, be it the young kids, the adolescents, the early adults, or even the adults who are struggling with their sexuality, would say the fact that that flag was there, this is a safe place to talk. I still wish we could do that in more and more offices. where we would be seen as being very visible as a safe place. Ensuring that the psychiatric workforce is well versed in delivering high quality care, culturally competent care, will go a long way. For one thing, it will strengthen our relationship as physicians with the minority and underrepresented groups. APA's Division of Diversity and Health Equity has developed a wealth of resources dedicated to helping psychiatrists and mental health professionals that treat diverse patient populations, including LGBTQ communities, similar to what the RCP. And I do say that we have the agreement, both in terms of our leaderships always coming to each other's meetings, but also the exchange of the educational materials. So I urge you to go on to psychiatry.org and look for the toolkits, fact sheets, video guidelines, and online learning modules. We have a guide that looks at working with transgender and gender non-conforming patients, the intimate partner violence, guide for psychiatrists treating LGBTQI IPV survivors, mental health fact sheets, and best practices working with the LGBTQ patient. All of these resources, I'd love you to go and have a look, because I love coming onto your side to look at what you have. And sometimes I will call up Paul Rees to say, and ask, am I able to share it, as we go about? And he's always said, yes, of course. And Adrian, I have to thank, whenever you come to the meeting and presents at our meetings, you're always there that remembers the LGBTQI community. I'm proud to be an openly gay psychiatrist. I'm proud to be the first openly gay CEO and medical director. However, even in spite of progresses we have made as a nation, there's still far too much bigotry. There are still far too many LGBTQ people who feel that they cannot be open and honest about who they are, be it with their colleagues, their friends, their family, and times even themselves, because of maybe where they live or because of their religions. I remember I always seem to, in my mind, remember young Matthew Shepard, beaten and hogtied and hung-tied on a fence, spread-eagled, to die in the freezing cold because he was in a gay bar and he happened to come upon a straight man when he left, who basically kidnapped him, and him and his friends then took him, beat him, and then basically left him for dead, spread-eagled. And that didn't happen too many years ago. So I offer to them, to all of us, I offer my encouragement and my support and say that you and we are not alone. We know that there are people willing to fight for freedom and equality for all people, whatever their race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, without regard to potential personal risk. It is my hope that we will one day have full equality and acceptance for all people and cultures in the United States and all over the world. The Royal College of Psychiatrists and the American Psychiatric Association stand as beacons of light to help the LGBTQI communities overcome the bigotry, hate, and homophobia and transphobia that still does exist, in spite of some of the victories we've had. I'm honored to be an honorary fellow of the RCP and the CEO and medical director of APA, and to stand here before you with an honor of giving this presidential invitational lecture. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, Saul, thanks so much for sharing your personal story. For me, both sort of upsetting and uplifting at the same time. And I think we both agree we've still got a long way to go, and it's great to see that APA are on that same journey that the FRCPsych are on. Now, we've got a number of questions, and I just want to go, first of all, to my immediate predecessor, Wendy Byrne, who is watching this afternoon or in the morning for you, Saul. So in relation to the next generation of psychiatrists, how do we train them in cultural competencies?
Thank you, Wendy, for that, and thank you for your presidency as well. You were, in some ways, the first president I really got to know when I came on, and then had the wonderful now opportunity, of being with Adrian now on this. I think the younger generation is actually teaching us how to do it. And so much, I thought 10 years ago, 5 years ago, I would not have spoken about the intersectionality, of people. And yet it was the young people who began to say it, I may be gay, but I'm also Black. I may be gay, but I may be an IMG. And we need to begin to start looking at and working towards where in some ways they're going to lead us, because they will become the leaders in the future that I think will do away with some of the I'll say, old-time views of what LGBTQ people are. And they're the ones who are also doing very innovative research. So, I'm very, as I like to say, I'm very bullish on the residents, fellows, or registrars, and fellows and early career psychiatrists, because I think they see the world very differently to, I'll say, some of the older generations. And I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I think they're helping us to say, this is what we need, for us to both ourselves and also work with our patients.
Okay, thanks for that, Saul. Another question. What advice do you have for LGBTQ psychiatrists starting out in their career now?
That's hard to answer, only because I grew up in a generation where I was sort of out during my residency training program. There were 3 other gay people in my program, some ahead of me, some behind me. But it was something that and I did it in California, which is the liberal state, I think in this day and age, we've got to remember that we need to become the heroes. And that if you're in a place that if you tell them they're gay, you're going to have repercussions on that, it's time for you to leave that program, and that divulging that early on. And I think that's one of the things I've seen when I've sat on interview panels with the younger generation, that those that come out or talk about their experience as being a minority or underrepresented person, they land up in places that actually really want them. Versus if they don't say it, they may be accepted into it because they have other attributes, brilliance, great grades, speak well, but then they hit the personal side of who they are, which isn't that what we as psychiatrists fight about, as to how do we bring in the personal. So I say to them, take the chance. If they don't want you, you actually don't want to be there. So isn't that the best route to go?
Okay, thanks for that, Saul. And I often speak to people, to new psychiatrists, and say, look around you. In 20, 30 years' time, people will be looking back and saying, how could you have done things in the way that you did them then? In relation to the subject we're talking about at the moment, what do you think are going to be the big things that we'll look back on and say we really should have moved faster and further quickly?
I think it's going to be that, I'll say, the white majority, be it white privilege or the white majority, did not realize that the world is changing, and it's changing in terms of BIPOC, in terms of LGBT, in terms of even IMGs, because you have planes now that you can be in one country one day and in another country the next day, that the movement has so changed as we become a global world on it. And I think that's what I think APA has been slow. I'll talk for APA. APA has been slow in recognizing that change. And it became really obvious, both with the George Floyd murder, and also what happened on the border, with the Hispanic populations, is that the fear that has been in this country about the minority groups becoming the majority has held us back. And I think that's where that our generation will be looked upon to say, why didn't you do more? And so I say to people now, yep, we should have, but now we have the chance to really change because we are in the seats that can affect change. So let's do it so we minimize the damage of how long it will continue. And in this country, in the United States, my feeling is it's going to be a battle, and it's going to be a battle of two forces, but we need to stand up for the equality of everyone,
Great, thanks for that, Saul. And now a question from Dinesh Bugra, who you mentioned in your talk. So Dinesh says, thanks, Saul, for your personal and institutional story. How do we continue to push the international agenda?
Well, obviously, I believe in the W.P.A., the World Psychiatric Association. I think we need to have a better coordination there. And Dr. Bugra, Professor Bugra, Dinesh, I mean, you did it very well in the papers that you created. Position statements that I think you put out 16 of them, if I remember correctly, looking at all aspects of what we as psychiatrists around the world could do. And it was really funny because some of the countries and some of those countries that tend to have more religious governments or very conservative governments who would not want to do something, that the psychiatrists, who may have been few and far between, would take the position statements of WPA to say, the world psychiatrists say we've got to be doing this. You shouldn't be doing this as well. And I think that's what I hope, that all the countries come together, understanding some are more conservative, some are more liberal. But you remember that each and every one of us went into psychiatry to take care of patients. And sometimes we have to stand up and say, no matter what the government believes, doing wrong, or we need more services. So Dinesh, I'm with you. I hope the WPA, and I believe that they're really trying to really step up and begin to become more active politically, with the clout of the WPA. But then, there are the countries like us, United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, that are really could maybe do a little more of stepping up when those things occur. And I know the Royal College of Psychiatrists have done a lot more of that than I think what the APA has done. So something that I'm going to walk in your shadow to try and follow.
Okay, Saul, I'm going to come to some questions now. There are a range of views and opinion on this issue, and I think it's right that we hear a spectrum of questions and views. I'll put the question as it's put. Does the APA support conversion therapy?
No, absolutely not. We've had that position now for 10 years. We know it doesn't work. And we fight it everywhere we can at the federal level, which we are trying to actually pass a federal, no conversion therapy allowed, but each and every state. And it's a hard sell, because many of them do it under the religious guise of, the Bible says, which means the religious freedoms that United States says they feel they founded on, gives them an out to do it. But at least we've begun to say you cannot do it with children, and we are fighting, when a child wants to go onto medications, as they come to puberty, we're fighting that battle as well, because there's some states who feel we should not be giving them, hormones, to suppress, what may have been their genetic outlook, So yeah, we do not at all. I don't think I've heard a member at APA, say that we think this is a legitimate treatment. If they are, they've chosen not to become, part of APA.
And just for the record, it's exactly the same for the FRCPsych, and we've supported the plea to formally put it into legislation to ban conversion therapy. So we utterly oppose it in all its forms. I'm going to put a question now from. Sorry, yeah, Saul.
So what you said is very important, Because if you get to do a national ban on conversion therapy, you send a message. It's part of the Dinesh Bogra question. You send a very strong, the first country to do it on a national level will begin to set the stage of saying, this is what needs to be the standard, And I think once that happens, the dominoes will begin to fall, not in every country. So I think that's a perfect, you give a great example of how we can each help each other across the world.
Okay, and another question. This is from John Boris. Now, John says, how do you reconcile the rights of transgender people treated in every respect as the gender of their choice, with the views I'm going to slightly sort of that with some women to reserve spaces? Now, I presume, John, you're referring to women whose gender is assigned from birth. I just want to make it absolutely clear that trans women are women. It's legally defined, and the Gender Recognition Act makes that absolutely clear. I would like to make a comment on this myself, but these are the debates that are out there in public, and just wonder whether you, from your point of view and APA's point of view, so whether you could reflect on that.
Right. I understand that people have diversity of opinions, but I keep saying psychiatry has always been seen as the art of psychiatry, not the science. We have fought so hard to, I'm not even saying not that we're ever going to do away with the art of psychiatry, but we fought so hard to do the science of psychiatry. And I think that's where I look at it from the transgender position. It is, the person feels who they are inside of them, just like you, if you're straight, feels this is who you are. So if something happened along the way, and maybe science will eventually show, some genetic thing that happened or a mutation, they still are that person. And I think that's the issue we've got to remember, is that why are we beginning to, once again, do apartheid? Separate some groups, because of either old knowledge or lack of knowledge or beliefs, even religious beliefs, and I'm not going to get into, the religion part of it, but I've seen, there are fundamental religions that have kept to it, but a large part of the average, the religions today have realized that as more knowledge has come about, they have to move a little, not to forget the tenets of what religion's about, of caring for everyone, loving everyone, peaceful, that's how I would answer it.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that, Saul. And I think I've got very sort of clear views on this. I think there is an unfortunate feeling in some quarters that trans people are sort of, out to get you. And I speak to lots of trans people. It is the last thing that they want to do. I mean, clearly, if every gender, there are, people with all sorts of issues, and that's true for everyone. But I think we overestimate the safety of the current environments that we have. I mean, for example, our traditional changing rooms, we know that very unpleasant things happen there. And the idea that we are going to, I think we ignore that too much. And I think actually we need to look at everybody's safety. And I think actually particularly the safety of trans people, who are actually much more at risk from others than others are at risk from them. It's so I just wanted to make my position really very clear on that. I just also, there is a question about concern about people who are on the autistic spectrum or intellectual disability, understanding of sexuality and sexual orientation, and whether there are issues for APA, whether this is something that you have considered. I mean, I would always say these things are always down to that individual everybody's individual identity, their circumstances, and it's right that we as professionals, we explore that with them, that we make sure that, as for everything that happens within medicine, that people have fully informed consent, and that may be different in for people with different needs. But Saul, what's your reflection on that?
I think you're correct. APA, we have these caucuses and committees that get formed, in the organization, and anyone can form a caucus. So we actually have had a very robust caucus around disabilities, intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities, where they advocate for us as to what legislation, when they see that things, in some states, are really being discriminatory, they will come to us and say, we need to start doing it. They will help us in terms of being the experts in the field as to how do we do it. So, I think in some ways, I think the disabilities, if I can put it that way, are in some ways the last of the forgotten, I'll say minority underrepresented groups that we really need to pay more attention. And it is becoming more and more an issue, for the APA to realize, we're a membership organization and we have to help every member be able to care for people and the practices that they have, and particularly around people with disabilities.
So, Saul, the session's coming to an end now. Just one final question from me. If you could wave your magic wand and you had 3 wishes that could come true in this area, what would they be?
I think the first wish would be is if we could get to a place where equality is just taken for granted, and I learned that in South Africa. Being white, you were automatically privileged, no matter how you look at it, But I look at the country now, certainly where Mandela took it over, I think it's equality for everyone. It's, we're a world who has huge resources, billionaires who have just so much money, they don't know what to do with it, that wouldn't it be nice if we could really begin to help those countries that are less equality in terms for everyone? So I think that's the first thing is, that my wish is that we could just get to where everyone is equal, stop the differences of what you look like, what religion you are, who you are, your sexual orientation, and just understand that we're all humans. I'm a little bit of a sci-fi, person, and you see a lot of the stories. It's like when suddenly you have a spaceship arrive at Earth from an outside galaxy that no one ever knew existed, and they suddenly feel, and that it's amazing how in all those stories that all the countries of the world of Earth would band together very quickly because they now had an outside threat to them. And I'm not talking about we want an outside threat, but I am talking about, wouldn't it be nice if we really could come in? I suppose this is what the United Nations was supposed to be about, that we really look to equality of everyone, where everyone should have food, shelter, and in some ways freedom, and freedom also of education and the way to live their lives. I think those are my wishes. I know it may not have quite answered you. I'd have to think about it more.
Okay, well, I hope your wishes come true, Saul. It's been really fantastic to listen to your journey, to hear about what you're doing, to hear your views. And I think we all know that we're on a journey and we've got to go much further and much faster and keep the dialogue going. We've certainly had the dialogue this evening. So thank you so much, Saul, for all you do and for giving up your time tonight. I'd also like to thank all our audience and for your participation. Thanks for your great questions. And a big thank you also to the college staff, and that's Helen, Leah, Thomas, Peter, Thomas, Peter, and Leah at our end, and at APA's end, Ginny and Katie. So thank you, because there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes to actually put these things on. So thank you so much to all of you, and enjoy the rest of your day, Saul, and enjoy your evening, all of those joining from the UK.
And
thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. Do we just leave?